Right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this URC History History Society seminar, and it's really great to have Susan MacDonald with us today, who's going to be giving us some insights into ministerial life in the turbulence of the 17th century. Um, well, could be more than that, but it's that's kind of the hint from her title. Susan is currently a professor of systematics and historical theology at Western Theological Seminary, even in Holland, Michigan, rather than Holland as in terms of across in Europe. And so it's really great that she's been able to find a slot with us this morning amidst her teaching. Obviously, Susanna is no stranger to us in the URC because although she's been teaching over in the US since 2007, she did train for ministry at Westminster College and also taught there on Senatus for a year. I think I'm just going to hand over to Susan now to give us her paper, which will be about half an hour, and then, as Michael said, we will be having a Q&A session after that, with the aim that we will be finishing by about 5 o'clock. Suzanne, over to you.
Wonderful. Let's have a look. Thank you so much. Just give me a thumbs up. Make sure you can hear me okay. Yes, splendid. Great. Warmest greetings to all of you. And it really is lovely to see all of your faces and friends, old and new, who are joining us for this. I'm in the midst of a project on a 17th century pastor called Henry Fairfax, who was a rather obscure and ordinary member of a very significant family during the civil wars in England. And we can perhaps talk more about him and his family in the Q&A time. But Henry was the rector of Ashton-under-Lyne parish near Manchester from 1619 until 1643. And as I was looking into that and his successors, I realised that the story of this parish, first under Henry Fairfax and then under his two successors, is kind of like a microcosm of the whole history of nonconformity, kind of small n, godly nonconformity in the 1620s and 30s, through to post-restoration nonconformity, capital N. So kind of the history of nonconformity for most of the 17th century. So what I'm going to do in this talk is sketch some of the contours of that for you, giving a few highlights from the tenure of each of the three ministers over this period of time. So first, Henry Fairfax, and what happened to him illustrates, I think, a good deal when it comes to the kinds of church matters that became major factors in the lead up to the civil wars. So we're going to take a snapshot of 4 very significant years in his ministry there to see what they can show us about Henry and about the parish of Ashton-under-Lyne near Manchester. So the first significant year for us is 1622. And that's when the Bishop of Chester, John Bridgeman, launched a visitation. That meant that he sent a list of questions around to the church wardens in every parish in the diocese about a number of things. Visitation articles were often about church life, even church fabric. But one of the many things that visitation questions were often designed to do was to ferret out parish priests who might have had Puritan tendencies. Puritan is a very vexed, very slippery term. Those who were identified by others as Puritans often referred to themselves simply as the godly. And the term Puritan meant different things to different people at different times. Even in this period, the kinds of people whom the authorities deemed to be Puritans differed in 1622 than from, say, 1625 onwards, when Charles I came to the throne and the church leaders that he favoured sort of shifted the goalposts. But with the 1622 visitation at Ashton in mind, Puritan clergy were unhappy with some of the requirements. That might be aspects of the wording of the services in the Book of Common Prayer, or the obligation to give communion only to those who knelt, or the requirement to make the sign of the cross at baptism, or wearing a surplice for services. If you conformed outwardly, even with like huge internal reluctance, then the visitations would not catch you out because you didn't openly break the rules. But then there were those clergy who periodically did break the rules, and they would get caught out if the church wardens gave honest answers to the visitation questions. Now, you might get away with a warning, or you might be thrown out of your ministry. The attitude of your bishop was key here. The bishops wrote their own questions, and by what they asked or didn't ask, and by the way they did or did not follow up, they could, if they wished, give cover to some clergy who broke some of the rules some of the time to enable them to stay in their parishes. And then there were those clergy who flagrantly and repeatedly broke most of the rules most of the time and sort of refused to work within the system at all, even in a minimal and token kind of way. And they usually were thrown out, even by otherwise sympathetic bishops. I think you can see how visitation questions could put church wardens in a bit of a bind. I mean, they're being asked to report on their parish priests. And you can imagine that that could make for some rather awkward situations. Often, the church wardens gave a two-word response to all of the visitation questions. Omnia bene, Latin for all is well. But the church wardens were under oath, and if they didn't answer the questions honestly and got found out, then they could get into serious trouble themselves. When the bishop or his deputies came to follow up, they would ask the church wardens to answer at least some of the questions in person, and they would also talk to the parishioners. So if the parish priest was not following all the rules, the church wardens pretty much had to be honest. And they were honest in Ashton in 1622, which means they got Henry Fairfax and his curate into trouble. They were cited for doing rather Puritan things. Henry Fairfax, it is said, administered the communion to those that did not kneel, and his curate did likewise, sometimes omitting to make the sign of the cross in baptism. Very fortunately for Henry and his curate, there is no sign in the records of any follow-up. But what does this tell us about the parish of Ashton and about Henry Fairfax? Well, first the parish. Obviously, they had some parishioners with godly tendencies. There were some who refused to kneel for communion and who did not want the sign of the cross on their babies at baptism. Thank you very much. But the records also tell us that in 1622, Ashton had a lecturer, in addition to Fairfax as their rector and his curate. Now, having a lecturer in a parish was a rather Puritan thing. Lecturers gave sermons outside the context of Sunday worship, which meant that at this time they did not have to use the Book of Common Prayer, they did not have to wear a surplice, and they weren't baptizing anyone or presiding at communion. So a lectureship was a fabulous backdoor way for ministers who refused to conform to still have a preaching ministry. And lectures were springing up all over the place in godly parishes until in 1629, King Charles I forbade any lecturers to preach without first reading a service from the Book of Common Prayer and without wearing a surplice. So sort of bam, really, that Puritan back door was slammed shut. While there were, of course, many, many issues that led to the breakdown between King and Parliament in the early 1640s, and so to the Civil Wars, passionately held religious views were a significant factor for many. And the godly, those of strong Puritan tendencies, were very likely to end up supporting Parliament. And Ashton is a case in point. Ashton-under-Lyne becomes part of the heartland for recruiting parliamentarian forces in Lancashire. So, although 1622 is still 20 years away from the start of the Civil War, what that visitation tells us about Ashton is a kind of step along that road. But what about Henry Fairfax himself? You could say, well, he was reported for doing rather Puritan things, so does that mean he must have had rather Puritanly inclined tendencies? Perhaps, but you could also think of it another way. Like I just said, the parish clearly had a strong godly contingent within it, so it is possible, more than possible, that this was less about Henry's own convictions and inclinations, and more about him being put under some pressure by members of the congregation. And also it's pretty clear the congregation is split. Some are kneeling, some aren't. Some are fine with the sign of the cross at baptism, some aren't. As a parish priest, that left Henry in a kind of uncomfortable spot, right? If he had strong convictions either way, he could have forced the issue either way. But it looks like he simply chose to acquiesce with whatever particular parishioners wanted. And our next key year suggests that that is probably what it was all about. Our next year is 1633. And this is the year that Henry Fairfax becomes a pluralist. That is, he takes another parish as well as Ashton-under-Lyne. He becomes the rector of Newton Kyme in Yorkshire, living in the gift of his father and also close to many members of his family. Now that was a decidedly non-Puritan thing to do. On the whole, Puritans of all kinds hated pluralist clergy because it meant they couldn't do a proper job as a preacher and a pastor for one of their congregations. They farmed that task out to a usually rather poorly paid curate instead. Sometimes a minister more or less had to take another parish because the income from one was too low to support him and his family. But that was emphatically not the case for Henry Fairfax. Ashton was a very well-paid living. Henry was receiving £200 a year from Ashton during the 1630s and early 40s. Now, that included renting out part of the rectory because, as we're going to see, Henry was almost never there in Ashton. So that included rent for the rectory. But still, the parish on its own was worth over £100 a year without that. And you were considered a gentleman if you had an income of around £100 a year, or indeed even less than that. And add to this, Newton Kyme in Yorkshire was a tiny and not very well paid parish. So Fairfax did not take Newton alongside Ashton because he needed to. He took it because he wanted to. And that was something no Puritan clergyman would do. From 1633 onwards, all the evidence suggests that Henry lived most of his time at Newton Kyme and only occasionally popped back to Ashton, paying a curate or an assistant minister to look after Ashton Parish and its worship for the rest of the time. Our next key year is jumping ahead another almost 10 years, and it's 1641. In terms of wider history, a lot is going on at this point, on the way towards the irretrievable breakdown between king and parliament that will lead to civil war. On a much smaller scale, things are falling apart for Fairfax at Ashton as well. There is this incredibly frustratingly difficult to interpret note at the end of the minutes of the April vestry meeting in 1641, which Fairfax was there to chair. And it's about how some of the church wardens were owed 16 shillings, fairly substantial sum. They were owed 16 shillings for explaining of their presentment as touching bowing at the name of Jesus. Now, bowing at the name of Jesus was one of a number of innovations in worship that became very controversial in the 1630s. This kind of thing was considered by many to be just one step away from outright popery, and it was being required by the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, and some of his bishops. It wasn't just Puritans who objected, plenty of other people did too. People who'd been otherwise very happy to conform to how the Church of England used to be before King Charles and his favoured prelates started messing with it from the mid-1620s onwards, and especially through the 1630s. We do not know exactly what had been going on in Ashton, and so what this presentment was all about, but it was clearly bad enough that it seems as though the church wardens didn't just write a presentment. That's usually what happened. The church wardens just wrote something. It looks like they would have had to trek to the church courts at Chester to explain whatever it was, given that they were owed 16 shillings. So we don't know what was going on, who was or wasn't bowing, and how this all came about. And we don't know what, if anything, Fairfax himself had to do with it. But later that year, in November of 1641, there's a warrant out. There's a warrant out summoning one of Henry's parishioners and another man for verbally abusing Henry Fairfax. They had called him a goose and a popish priest. Now then, if he had actually been trying to insist on all of his Ashton parishioners bowing at the name of Jesus by 1641, I think I would want to call him a goose as well. I suspect, though, that by this point, the ecclesial ground had shifted so much and things were so fraught that even if he'd simply, continued to wear a surplice or something, that would have been enough to wind up many of his parishioners. It is quite conceivable that the same rector who was considered to be mildly Puritan-ish in 1622 could be called a popish priest in the very changed atmosphere of 1641. Our last big year for Henry Fairfax is 1643, with the Civil War very well underway. The previous year, in 42, some of Ashton's parishioners had taken legal advice on whether they had grounds to have Fairfax removed as their rector. The person whose advice they sought was none other than John Bradshaw. For 17th century history nerds, that is a name to conjure with. At this time, he was simply an important Cheshire lawyer. But later, he'd become the president of the High Court of Justice that tried Charles I, and then the first president of the Council of State in the new republic. Anyway, Bradshaw wrote to the parishioners to say they did indeed have a strong case. And in 1643, the parishioners took that case to the Parliamentarian Committee for Plundered Ministers. The committee agreed with them and officially removed Fairfax as the rector of Ashton-under-Lyne in August of 1643 for non-residence, for being an absentee rector, which indeed he was. We can talk about what became of Henry after this in the Q&A time if you like. But in the meanwhile, the committee also gave the parish to John Harrison. Harrison had effectively been acting as the rector for years anyway, but on a fraction of the rector's pay. There is a myth in a number of the secondary sources that Henry Fairfax was forced out of his living for being a royalist, and that John Harrison was forced onto the parish by a party of parliamentarian soldiers, all of which is utter twaddle. The primary culprit here is John Walker, which will not be a surprise to the 17th century nerds among you. He included a wildly erroneous entry for Henry Fairfax and indeed John Harrison, kind of combined there, in his Sufferings of the Clergy in 1714. The revised edition of Walker from the early 20th century effectively wipes Henry Fairfax off the list of clergy who were rejected for royalism, saying quite rightly there is no evidence whatsoever of Fairfax being ejected as a royalist. Again, we can talk more about the details of this in the Q&A if you like. The bottom line, though, is while it is true that the Committee for Plundered Ministers did indeed toss out rectors for being royalists or malignants, as they were called, that wasn't the issue for Henry Fairfax. He was dismissed for being an absentee rector. And Harrison was not imposed on the parish by soldiers. The committee appointed Harrison as rector of Ashton-under-Lyne instead of Fairfax because that's what the parish actually asked them to do. Harrison went on to be a much-loved minister at Ashton for the next almost 20 years and made Ashton a major centre of Lancashire Presbyterianism. In the first half of the 1640s, someone like Harrison and his parish at Ashton were kind of on the front lines of radicalism for many. They were the hotter sort of Protestants. They were in the vanguard of parliamentarianism and resistance to the king. By the mid-1640s, though, it was the independents who were the radical ones, and the Presbyterians who were seen as the conservatives, with their hopes for a strongly enforced national church with a structure similar to the Church of Scotland. The independents, with their desire for self-governing congregations, considered that the Presbyterians were likely to be as religiously oppressive as the former Church of England has been. The poet John Milton, ardent independent, expressed this in his typically brilliant and witty way in one of his sonnets when he said that new presbyter is but old priest writ large. So the independents became the religious radicals, in effect, and the Presbyterians were seen as the religious conservatives. It's also the case that the labels Presbyterian and independent also became associated with very different approaches to politics and the conduct of the war. But we have to be careful here with the terminology, because there isn't always a straightforward overlap in that not all ecclesial Presbyterians, so to speak, were also political Presbyterians. Even so, on the whole, we can say that the Presbyterians were the ones who tended to desire a peace treaty with the king, for example, whereas the independents were generally the ones who pushed for outright military victory. Anyway, all of this is playing out in miniature right around Ashton-under-Lyne. Like I mentioned, Ashton became one of the centres of Presbyterianism in Lancashire, and Harrison was a key figure in all of that. The Booths of Dunham Massey, who were the patrons of the Ashton living, also became leading Presbyterians. Old Sir George, who died in 1652, and then young Sir George, his grandson and heir. And as I'm just saying that, I'm thinking, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember you being served an old Mr. Grace and young Mr. Grace. Dearie me. Anyway, old Sir George Booth and young Sir George Booth. And the Booths were one of the most important parliamentarian families in Lancashire and Cheshire. But right across the River Tame from Ashton-under-Lyne in what was then Cheshire were the Duckenfields. The Duckenfields were another major parliamentarian family in the region, and just before the Civil War in 1641, Robert Duckenfield had installed the very controversial firebrand preacher Samuel Eaton as his chaplain. Eaton had to leave for America in the 1630s and then returned to England and established in 1641. He returned after the imprisonment of Archbishop Laud. So he came back in 1641, and by 1643 or early 1644, he'd established a gathered independent church in the Duckenfield family chapel. Again, for fellow 17th century nerds, Eaton and Duckenfield even get a mention in Thomas Edwards's Gangrena. Edwards was an ardent Presbyterian who wrote the rather sensationalised Gangrena to expose what he considered to be the horrific mushrooming of independents and heretical sectaries across England. And Edwards claimed that the Duckenfield Chapel under Eaton was the first formally organised, gathered, independent congregation in England, and he might well have been right about that. Back on the other side of the Tame, though, in Ashton, is Harrison, fierce critic of independency in sermons, in print, and in organising petitions to Parliament, asking them to suppress the kinds of gathered congregations like the one in the Duckenfield Chapel. Eaton objected strenuously to being lumped in with the independents because he was really a Congregationalist. That is, he maintained the importance of preaching to the wider parish community while he restricted communion to the covenanted members of his gathered church. Strictly speaking, independent ministers saw no wider call than to their gathered congregation. But the term independent was kind of used as a catch-all term for not Presbyterian and not Episcopalian, so he just got labelled as an independent anyway. So these divisions between Ashton Presbyterian Church and Duckenfield Chapel, Harrison and Eaton, the Booths and the Duckenfields, exemplify so much about the wider history of the time, not just with regard to the two different approaches to the church, but also the growing political and military divisions within the parliamentarian side. As we did with Henry Fairfax, we'll look at just a couple of dates for Harrison, which encapsulate not just aspects of his time at Ashton, but the wider story of the times as well. So, first, 1646. This is when Harrison is at the forefront of organising a petition to Parliament to be allowed to set up Presbyterian church government in Lancashire. And as a result, Lancashire becomes the first and indeed the only place outside of London to be granted permission to set up classes. And the Manchester classis, including Ashton-under-Lyne, was the very first of those. And Harrison wanted to ensure that Lancashire Presbyterianism would be properly Presbyterian. London's Presbyterian system was what one of the Scottish commissioners to the Westminster Assembly, Robert Bailey, famously called a lame Erastian presbytery, far too much of a role for Parliament. Lancashire's proposal was a more clerical form of Presbyterianism, much closer to Scottish polity. There's a minister, Adam Martindale, who was minister of a parish close to both Ashton and Dukenfield, and who was rather more sympathetic to what the kind of thing going on in Dukenfield. He did not like this hardline approach, and he describes Harrison and the other two leading lights of Lancashire Presbyterianism in this way. They were very zealous, usually called rigid Presbyterians, that were for the setting up of the government of the Church of Scotland amongst us, and the utter extirpation of independency. One thing that very quickly became evident, though, was you can set up Presbyterian church structures, but you can't necessarily get people to submit to them. The records show that Harrison and other ministers in the classis struggled mightily with their bolshy laity, who simply refused to accept the sanctions of church discipline. And of course, by this point, if you didn't like what was happening in your Presbyterian church, you could simply leave and go to another kind of church entirely if you wanted. And for those at Ashton, that included just popping over the Tame to join Eton's gathered congregation at Dukenfield, and the evidence suggests that quite a number did. The next two dates mark periods of imprisonment for Harrison, both of them associated with suspicions of royalist activity. And this was typical of many Presbyterians after the execution of Charles I, which almost all of them utterly abhorred, very much including Harrison, who had co-signed a pamphlet in 1649 after the execution of the king, lamenting the horrid murder of the king. Many Presbyterians initially hoped for Charles II to become king on the condition that he would impose Presbyterianism on England. Later, though, it just became a desperate desire for him to become king anyway, to save some semblance of the old political, social and religious order. Anyway, September 1651, shortly after the Battle of Worcester, John Harrison is arrested. He's arrested on suspicion of having been in correspondence with Charles, and he's imprisoned at Liverpool with a number of other Presbyterian ministers. He was soon released, but it's worth noting that Colonel Robert Dukenfield, he of the chapel, independent congregation there, Colonel Robert Dukenfield took part in his trial. Also, as an ardent Presbyterian, Harrison was a dedicated attender of classis meetings, and he had to miss the October one on account of being in prison. He was back for November. And then next key date, 1659, August 1659, to be more precise about it. You've just had a year of utter chaos, governmental chaos, following the death of Oliver Cromwell in 1658. And in August 1659, young Sir George Booth led what's become known as Booth's Uprising. Not explicitly royalist, but an awful lot of former royalists joined in, along with many Presbyterians. It was very easily put down, and Robert Dukenfield, and especially his brother John, were at the forefront of doing just that. But Booth's uprising was also a straw in the wind for what was to come soon afterwards, with the Restoration in 1660. Although, as best we can tell, it doesn't look like Harrison took a direct part in the rising, he must have been closely enough associated with it that things took a much more serious turn for him this time. He was taken to London shortly after the rising was put down, and he was imprisoned in the Tower. Again, I love that one of the ways we know about this and how long he was imprisoned for is because the minutes record that he missed the classis meetings. So he was absent in September, October, November and December of 1659, and still in January of 1660, which is the month that he was released. And then he was dutifully back at classis in February, and for most of the meetings from then on until Manchester classis ceased to exist. Charles II entered London triumphantly in May of 1660, and the last meeting of the Manchester classis was in August of 1660. After the Restoration, Harrison kept up a rearguard action on behalf of dissenters, petitioning repeatedly for leniency in matters like wearing a surplice, the sign of the cross at baptism, all the kinds of classic Puritan sorts of things that I mentioned in relation to the 1622 visitation. But as we know, all of that is to no avail. So following the Act of Uniformity in 1662, Harrison refuses to conform and he's ejected. Sir George Booth, he of Booth's Uprising, since created Baron Delamere by Charles II. Sir George Booth, he's the patron of the Ashton living, and he offers to install Harrison's son, Maurice, into the living. Maurice had conformed. But Harrison did not think he would be a suitable minister for Ashton. So he asked instead for his good friend, Thomas Ellison, to take his place. Rather poignantly, Ellison had been ordained as a Presbyterian minister after being examined at that very last meeting of the Manchester Classis in August of 1660. He was willing to conform, though, and he was episcopally ordained in 1661. I think it's rather droll that he's noted in the Church of England records as the minister of Flixton that year. Flixton was the congregation he'd served after his Presbyterian ordination. So he was the minister of Flixton in 1662, and then at 1661. And then in 1662, he became the rector of Ashton-under-Lyne. The parish register of Ashton notes the first funeral conducted according to the Book of Common Prayer after all the turmoil of the preceding years. It says, Ralph Wood, Audenshaw, Jr., the first that Mr. Ellison buried with the book. That was on the 5th of October, 1662. And the register also notes the first day that Ellison used the new stone font for baptism. It was a brand new font because the medieval one had been lost during the wars, and the Puritan practice was for a portable font to be brought to the front of the church for a baptism rather than a stone font permanently at the church entrance. So the new stone font at the Restoration restored the old tradition, and that occasion was significant enough to be noted in the parish register. Ellison and Harrison were really good close friends, and Harrison remained at Ashton in the congregation under Ellison's ministry, in addition to preaching illegally elsewhere. The 5 Mile Act of 1665, though, forced him to leave. He was able to return to Ashton in the late 1660s, but he died in 1670, and Ellison preached a very warm funeral sermon for him, as Calamy tells us. Harrison had been a beloved and a respected figure in the parish, and he was buried in the chancel of Ashton Church, although his memorial tablet was moved into the churchyard sometime in the late 19th century. Ellison died in 1700, having served Ashton for nearly 40 years. He doesn't leave much of a mark in the records, but a tale arose that he chose to be buried in the nonconformist cemetery at, wait for it, Dukenfield Chapel, which had turned Presbyterian in the 1680s after having been the independent rival to Harrison at Ashton in the 40s and 50s. And that would have been the perfect, ironic and apt end to the whole story, wouldn't it? The Presbyterian who conformed to the Church of England but chose to be buried in a nonconformist cemetery. It is possible, but it does seem as though he too was buried in Ashton Parish Church. His memorial tablet was in the church until at least the late 19th century. So I hope you get a little bit of a sense now about how the parish of Ashton, with just those 3 ministers from 1619 to 1700, sums up so much about the turbulent history of that period and the history of nonconformity too. And I do, though, love the way that this does seem to end. How when it comes to the Restoration, Harrison couldn't in good conscience conform, but his friend Ellison could. Harrison continues to sit under Ellison's ministry. Ellison preaches his funeral sermon. And then how they were both laid to rest in the chancel of the parish church that they had so faithfully served. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was really, really insightful into that period of history and all the different going-ons.
Oh, yeah. it's mad out there, but it's incredibly exciting, and I just love how, I mean, I'm sure this is the case all over the country, right? That you have little microcosms of what's going on, but Ashton just seems to draw so many of these threads together, and it just happened to be because of Henry Fairfax I began to look into Ashton and saw, wow, this is a really fascinating one to dig into.
Thank you. Right, so the floor is open to everyone else for questions. So yeah, hands up. Who would like to ask the first kind of full question? Roger, over to you.
Hi, somebody's got to start. Thank you very much, Suzanne. That's a very interesting talk. It's slightly outside of my period comfort zone, but I just wanted to pick up on one topic that interests me, and that's the concept of the lecturer. You mentioned about the lecturer at the time of the first minister, and was the lecturer appointed by the minister? I'll use that term, and if so, in a sense, what happened to him? I assume it was a him
It
during
was.
the period that you've been covering. Did they just disappear from the scene, or were they
So
there in the background?
Such a great question. And no, on the whole, lecturers weren't appointed by the resident clergy, although they could be. Very often, the patron of the living would be someone
Ah,
who'd appoint a
right.
lecturer, or a particular group within the congregation might also raise the money to have a lecturer as well. And the lecturer could be congenial to the parish and the rector, or the lecturer could be a kind of counter voice to
Yes, yeah.
the established rector and so on. There's no sense whatsoever of any antagonism there between Henry Fairfax. We don't know the name. I don't. Oh, actually, we probably do know the name of his curate. Forgotten it at the moment. At this point in time, and the lecturer. The lecturer was called Thomas Paybody, or possibly Peabody, but it looks like Paybody. And so annoyingly, we know almost nothing else about him. He only crops up because there's clerical subsidies. There's amounts of money that clergy need to pay in this period. And there was a subsidy raised for the Palatinate, for the cause of Elizabeth and Frederick of Bohemia in that year. And Thomas Paybody, lecturer, Ashton-under-Lyne, paid his dues towards that, as anyone who was an ardent hot Protestant would, because that was, that's one of the ways you showed your strong Protestant godly tendencies, is supporting Elizabeth and Frederick. So on that, we don't know any more specifics about Thomas Paybody, but for lecturers on as a whole, they really 1629 was that year when Charles I sent an edict out to all of the bishops saying, we're fed up of all these lecturers doing their seditious stuff in this unofficial capacity. So they need to wear a surplice. They need to preach from the Book of Common Prayer. And the third thing I didn't add was they need to state that they're prepared to take a parish. So that really closed down on it. And there's all sorts of other ways in which lecturers had been funded that Charles I really, and his favoured prelates really stomp on. So lectureships become a lot more, it's a lot more difficult to sustain a godly lectureship after that. So yeah, fabulous.
Right. Thank you.
I think the next one is Hopper A on the. Sorry.
Sorry, just to unmute myself there. Thank you very much. That was a super talk, Suzanne. I really enjoyed it. Very lively and very interesting. I've just learned a lot about Henry Fairfax's early career there. Do you think that he probably left for Newton Kyme because it was it was an easier life, a less difficult parish to preside over, and also was he not in amongst all of his family?
Yes.
In
Oh,
that part of Yorkshire. So
Yeah.
And maybe he just preferred Yorkshire to Lancashire.
Oh, totally. Yeah. So this is the thing, right? And this is something else to kind of clarify. So Henry Fairfax's earlier years are quite difficult to piece together. And one of the sources we do have for this is it's two sources. There's a couple of biographies, little mini biographies written of Henry Fairfax by his son Brian. His son Brian is, cough, cough, shall we say, decidedly unreliable about the earlier history of his father for all sorts of reasons. He has a particular picture that he wants to paint of his father, and there are some inconvenient details, like him being chucked out, that don't fit with that picture. So we do have a suggestion from Brian that Henry Fairfax was at Newton Kyme first before he even went to Ashton-under-Lyne. That's unlikely. Well, he might have been there in a kind of unofficial capacity as a curate or something. They already had a rector, a very long-standing rector, and Henry took over from him when he died, Oswald Chambers, when he died in 1633. But here's the thing about Newton Kyme. It's a gift in the living of Henry Fairfax's father. Oh, here we go again. Old Sir Thomas Fairfax, first Baron Fairfax. And so when the previous incumbent died in January of 1633, then old Sir Thomas, Henry's father, petitions Charles I to allow Henry to become a pluralist, to allow Henry to take Newton Kyme as well. And I mean, almost immediately, Henry Fairfax is there. They pack their bags from Ashton, him and his family. By this time, he had a second wife and several children of his own and a stepchild. And they're in Newton Kyme before you can blink. He's there. It probably is a much more congenial parish, and he's there in the heart of his close family and his extended family. So Newton Kyme is the parish of the kind of cousin branch, the Fairfaxes of Steeton, and so on. And he's around the corner. And there's this beautiful letter. There's lots of family letters that have survived from Henry's older brother, Ferdinando. So he becomes second Baron Fairfax. So Ferdinando Fairfax to Henry at Newton Kyme, where he says, oh, Henry, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to see you for the whole of 10 days. Now, if he's having to apologize for not seeing Henry for like 10 days, that tells you how often they're seeing each other, right? Henry loves it there. So we have all sorts of evidence. There are letters from parishioners at Ashton writing to Henry about issues at Ashton at Newton Kyme. They're addressed to him at Newton Kyme. I have not found a single letter from 1633 all the way through until that crucial year of 1641 addressed to Henry Fairfax at Ashton. Only at Newton Kyme. And you have him signing all sorts of legal documents in York and stuff. So it's pretty clear. He's in Newton Kyme, he loves it, and he's using the very big income from Ashton, thank you very much, to subsidise his lifestyle in Yorkshire. You can kind of see why they got fed up at that, right?
Yeah. But did he not get ejected after the restoration from, was it Bolton Percy he moved to?
Oh, excellent. So let's fill in.
So he wasn't a royalist after all if he was ejected.
Yes, although this is really interesting too. So he's in Newton Kyme, basically from 1633 onwards, just taking the money from Ashton. 1633 onwards. Now, in 1646, he gets the much bigger living around the corner, right, still in the heart of Fairfax country, at Bolton Percy. So in 1646, he leaves Newton Kyme, he goes to Bolton Percy, big parish, rather like Ashton, big, wealthy parish. Now, the key thing about 1646 is Bolton Percy parish was under the gift of the Archbishop of York. At that point, 1646 is when bishops are abolished, officially abolished. Now, the actual Archbishop of York, John Williams, at that time, he'd scarpered off to Wales well before that. But 1646, there's no incumbent at Bolton Percy. The previous one has died. And it's round the corner from the key seat of his older brother, Ferdinando, at Nunappleton, right? And so the chances are it's Ferdinando, his brother, who says, hey, Henry, vacancy here, pop in. And so he's actually the parish minister of his older brother, Sir Ferdinando, and then later his nephew, Sir Thomas, young Sir Thomas. Now, 1660 comes around, and it looks like Henry chose to resign. He did not wait to be forced out by the Act of Uniformity in 1662. And here's the likely reason for this as best we can discern. the living of Bolton Percy Church is in the gift of the Archbishop of York. So Henry Fairfax's appointment was irregular. He ought not to have been there, right? Once we have an Archbishop of York back, Henry seems to choose to withdraw, probably for those sorts of reasons, so the Archbishop of York can appoint his own guy. And here's the thing, the guy he appoints, oh, I love this, is a guy called Tobias Wickham. Tobias Wickham is actually Henry Fairfax's nephew by marriage, and he's also the son of a previous incumbent of Bolton Percy. A few incumbents back, the godly bishop of York, Toby Matthew, has appointed a guy, Henry Wickham, to be the rector of Bolton Percy. This Tobias Wickham was Henry's son, and Henry had married one of so Henry Wickham had married one of Henry Fairfax's second wife's sisters, because this is how it goes in gentry families, right? And so that made Tobias his nephew. So he stepped aside in effect for protocol's sake and for his nephew. It's awesome. There's all sorts of, I mean, I did Henry Fairfax in Ashton and a little bit in Yorkshire, but the rest of my research is kind of on Henry Fairfax later on, and there's all sorts of fun stories if you want to explore them too. But that I think is significant, that he was not ejected. He chose to back off. He was also like in his 70s and probably done with it. I think, so he and his wider family were all very supportive of General Monk coming down, doing his thing, and then the Restoration. There's all sorts of interesting stories to tell, including about Henry Fairfax's son Brian, and his role in encouraging General Monk to come down into England. There's a fabulous story, the Winter Journey, the Iter Borealis, that Brian, Henry's younger son, tells about that. So I don't think there was any problem with Henry Fairfax conforming to the Book of Common Prayer or having any. He remained a JP. Right? Henry Fairfax remained a JP in the Restoration, which meant he had to support the restoration of the monarchy and he had to support the church settlement. He remained a JP till his death. He stepped aside because it wasn't really his place to be there.
Thank you very much. That was excellent.
Oh, it's so great. Sorry, you can tell I'm just nerding out here. I love this. I don't get to do it very often. Sorry.
John Lander.
We'll need to unmute.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
I've learned a lot this afternoon about the difference between the Presbyterians and the Independents. Can you explain to me why the Duckenfield Society, which started off as being clearly a radical and independent, later turned to become Presbyterian?
Yes. Oh, again, great story here. So one of the key Presbyterian ministers in Harrison's time was a guy called John Angier, right? He was like, there's this cohort. Lancashire is just full of terrific Presbyterian ministers who leave us significant records. They write diaries, they write all sorts of things. So there's John Angier, who's a Presbyterian, along with John Harrison. The independent congregation collapses. Loss of ministers, I think I'd have to double check. It collapses post-Restoration. And of all people, the one who steps in to take the place of the independent ministers is the nephew of John Angier. So it seems as though, and I'd have to go back and double check. The independent congregation basically imploded,
Okay.
and the ministers left. And there was a vacuum. There was no one there. And Samuel Angier was invited to come in. It's actually, so Samuel keeps incredible records of, it's like well, it's not parish, it's the church records, so all the marriages, births and deaths. But he also keeps notes of significant events locally, nationally and internationally in the Duckenfield, now Presbyterian, chapel records. And this is actually the source of the rumour that Thomas Ellison chose to be buried at Duckenfield. Because
is there any reason why this congregation imploded then?
There is, and I don't know. I'd have to look up. Let me just, shoot me an email and I'll get back to you. I know there were issues, either a minister left or was chucked out, an independent minister. but I don't know what the issues were behind that.
Okay.
So shoot Michael has my email. Shoot me an email, and I do have written down somewhere something of what was going on there. And I can fill you in with as much as I know. And for what it's worth, his record of Ellison's death made people think, oh, well, he must have been buried there because he records the deaths. But he recorded any number of events, and he just put Thomas Ellison, rector of Ashton-under-Lyne, died February 1669-70. So it's not necessarily that he was buried there, just he's recording an event of local significance. But who knows? So yeah, drop me a line and I will send you what I can find out about why
Thanks.
it seems to be independent.
John Bradbury.
Thank you. That was just fabulous, Suzanne. Loved it. I'm interested, I suppose, in the perspective of the worshipping congregation throughout this turbulent period. One gets the sense that they were reasonably broad. You know, some would put up with the sign of the cross at baptism, others wouldn't, and so on and so forth. So they're straddling quite a spectrum at the start of all of this. It's perfectly possible to stay in the same place but get labeled various different things as the context moves around you massively. I'm just wondering what we know about the continuity or discontinuity of the practicing worshipping life of this congregation throughout the period as a congregation, rather than necessarily the various clergy that serve them. Have you picked up much on that as you've worked on this?
Oh, great. So there's most of what we can find out about the congregation is by inference and by the parish records as best we can. It's difficult to put together, but my sense is that the congregation, the initial kind of variation spectrum within the congregation remained to some extent. And then when you had the freedom to choose, when things just exploded in the 1640s, one of the things we know about Ashton Parish is it was majority parliamentarian, but not entirely. So there are some Ashton parishioners who joined the King's Army. Right. So even during the civil wars, Ashton is not uniform. Now, it belongs in, for what it's worth, the Salford Hundred and the Blackburn Hundred. So the southeast of Lancashire are the heartlands of parliamentarian recruitment, but it's not uniform. So we know that there were divided loyalties in Ashton Parish during the civil wars. And for all we know, there might have been some beleaguered conformists, some who were still prayer book church people who just had to shift for themselves as best they could, or just sit sullenly in their seats while Harrison did his Presbyterian thing. What we also know from the records of Ashton Parish and Duckenfield is that a number of folks ceased to be Presbyterians and joined the independent congregation, and that continued into the Restoration. So Ashton as a parish was kind of holding together diverse views. As best we can tell, Ashton as a parish fragmented during the 40s, the 50s, and on into the Restoration, so that it, just like so many other places, it was no longer, the one worshipping community in that parish. So other things we know, how did worship, absolutely certainly, I think, Henry Fairfax remained prayer book, and indeed, technically he was obliged to all of his ministry there. Harrison probably very early on did not, so well before the Directory of Public Worship was out, the signs are he would have been ditching the Book of Common Prayer. I think it's notable that Ashton Parish chose to write in their registers the first person buried by the book by Mr. Ellison. They respected Ellison, but you can feel the kind of, oh, okay. And the first use of the new font. So Ellison was, as he needed to be, frankly, a straight, in ceremonial respects, a straight down the line conformist. He knew eyes were on him. It's also true to say that Manchester area as a whole went quite ardently royalist at the Restoration. They were doing the bonfire thing. They had been known as the parliamentarian heartlands, and they just partly Presbyterianism, partly making sure to rehabilitate, I think, their community. So as best we can tell, and it's very difficult. There's that spread remains, and it leads to a fragmented parish later on. I can't see the chats, but I think, Michael, did you want to say what you put up there?
It's just a link to the website you wanted highlighted.
Oh, yes, yes. Okay, so for those of you who are not quite yet 17th century nerds, and especially Civil War nerds, and for those of you who already are and want a fabulous resource, go to two websites: the Civil Wars Petitions website, which is a fabulous source for how people on the ground, ordinary people on the ground, experience the wars and their aftermaths, and The World Turned Upside Down, which is, and these are all yay for Professor Andy Hopper, that's just fabulous resources, podcasts, recommendations for reading and stuff on the whole Civil Wars era, lead up, Civil Wars, aftermath. Those are just amazing resources. So yay to Andy Hopper and his team for those.
Thank you. And Margaret, I think we have time for your question, but this will have to be our last one.
Thank you. Inevitably, we have to use shorthand.
Yeah.
So we label people.
Yep.
We've heard Presbyterians, Independents, Episcopalians, but the elephant in the room are the recusants.
Very
Can you
good.
tell us more about the
Yes.
Catholics in
Oh,
Ashton
okay.
in particular?
So I can tell you, so Ashton, as far as we can tell in Ashton-under-Lyne, not a high proportion of recusants, but in Lancashire as a whole, this is a key factor, because in Lancashire as a whole, there's a significant proportion of recusant, of Roman Catholic gentry in various regions, not so much in the southeast parts, which tend to go parliamentarian, but elsewhere. And this is a huge factor in the lead up to the civil wars for Lancashire and the stress Lancashire is under, because just before October 1641, you have the Irish Rebellion, right, which really gets people nervous, and all sorts of horror stories are filtering over into England about the terrible things that the Roman Catholics have been doing to the Protestants in Ireland. You know how this goes geography-wise. Lancashire is right there. There's great anxiety about the Roman Catholic population in Lancashire. And then once the civil wars are underway, actually, the Roman Catholics keep fairly quiet initially. And the royalist, the main royalist figure in Lancashire, James Stanley, initially Lord Strange, his dad dies right at the start of the Civil Wars while he's besieging Manchester, and he becomes Earl of Derby. He's initially very nervous about including the Roman Catholic gentry in the King's army, because he knows that that will drive large numbers of otherwise uncommitted Lancashire people into the arms of Parliament, because they don't want, the King's army being identified with Roman Catholics. So the presence of a large number of significant gentry who are recusants has actually a big plays significantly into the nature of the civil wars in Lancashire and how Lancashire allegiance, basically, and so on. So not so much in Ashton itself, but when we think about Lancashire in the civil wars, it's significant. And eventually, I mean, they come into the King's army. One of the things about the civil war in Lancashire is so it's all over the place. It's not a big set piece battle. It's all sorts of smaller battles until we get the Second Civil War, Preston, 1648. That's decisive. But a large number of the royalist forces in Lancashire end up joining the King's army elsewhere. So the royalist forces, including the Catholic forces for the King, are very often being sent off elsewhere and not so much in Lancashire. And that's actually seen as quite a good thing for the Roman Catholics. Get them out of Lancashire to the King's army elsewhere, which might help recruiting amongst the rest of the Lancastrians, because there aren't the Catholics there as much. So big issue, generally not so much in Ashton itself. Great question.
It's also a reminder, I would say, that it is a particular sort of gentry family that can call upon its own retainers to do what was expected of them. As always, it's the people at the top who ensure that the people at the bottom don't have much say.
Generally, that's true. And that was definitely happening on all sides. There is a fun anecdote about this, though. So James Stanley, Earl of Derby, by this time, he gets really narked because some of his tenants have gone and flipping joined the parliamentarian. He'd call them in, come, fight for the king, follow your lord here. Because, I mean, Stanley... Derby, big deal in Lancashire, right? And also the Isle of Man. So, my tenants are revolting, basically. So, yes, in the broad picture, allegiance was often determined by factors like that. But people could, if people felt strongly enough, they could buck that trend. Oh man, it's just a fascinating overall topic of who ends up joining which armies and why. And of course, for a lot of the common soldiers, if you lose a battle and you get captured, do you want to die or do you want to fight for the other side? Your choice. Well, guess what happens? Yeah, fabulous. So good. If any of you want to keep the conversation going, I'm happy, shoot me emails and things as we need to shut down here. But always happy to to continue to nerd out about such things.
Thank you, Suzanne. That's really nice to hear that you are happy to continue conversations with us over email and on these things.
If we're able to stay open, I'm happy to stay open, but we probably all have to go.
We do try and keep these sessions to an hour. But thank you so much for that really insightful piece of period of history and using those characters and all of that.